Well, good evening, or good morning, good afternoon, good middle of the night, whatever it is for you as you're watching us. I'm Chuck. I've got Brock with me today, and we are discussing generous theology. And today, once again, we're spending some time with Richard Mouw's book, He Shines in All That's Fair, Culture and Common Grace. And this book is made up of a series of lectures, for the most part, that Dr. Mouw gave at the Henry Staub lecture series at Calvin College a number of years ago. And today we're on chapter 3, and it is the title chapter. It is the chapter entitled, He Shines in All That's Fair. And we're going to spend some time sort of working through Mouw's discussion of common grace. And this really is sort of, I think, the centerpiece of this book. Not that the rest of the book isn't important to it, but many of the other chapters get into more specific issues. Next time we'll be talking about infralapsarianism versus supralapsarianism. Last week we spent some time talking about the history of the split between the Christian Reformed Church and the Protestant Reformed Church, and they're all important issues around the topic of common grace. But here today is sort of the heart of the discussion. What is common grace? Why is it that many Calvinists feel that this is an important enough doctrine to spend a great deal of time on? Why has there been some controversy over the idea of common grace? Why are there some Reformed folks who feel very strongly that discussions of common grace are wrong-headed and lead us in the wrong direction? And so this chapter really sort of helps us set the stage by getting at the heart of this particular doctrine. And I'll just start right out with the title of the chapter. The title of the book, "He Shines in All That's Fair," comes from a hymn, and it talks a little bit of, just thinking about that line, "He shines in all that's fair," is again sort of, it gives us this sense of all of creation singing. And God showing himself in all parts of creation, and creation being much, much larger than just the relationship between God and humanity, more than just about sin and salvation. And yet it's all sort of tied up into those issues as well, because certainly God shining in all that's fair, well, we as humans are seeing that shining. We have, the fact that sin is in the world, and so he shines in all that's fair. Well, what's fair and what's not? What's beautiful and what's not? And is the work of unbelievers, can that even possibly be considered fair? And those fair things, those beautiful things that God shines in, does he take delight in his creation, even when that creation is tainted in some ways by sin? And that's the question that Dr. Mouw begins with in this chapter. And he starts with sort of an interesting discussion. He says, he quotes an Anglican theologian by the name of Austin Farr. And Mouw says, in one of his published sermons, this theologian, Austin Farr, describes his efforts to reconcile his theological convictions about sin and unbelief with his daily encounters with flesh and blood unbelievers. So, Farr, he's a theologian. Every day in dealing with theology, he understands, he has convictions about sin and about unbelief, and how God hates sin and God hates unbelief. And yet he also, in his everyday life, he has daily encounters with flesh and blood unbelievers who he finds at least some things about them to be beautiful and good. He says in his days at Oxford University, he would often attend one of the campus evangelistic services that were regularly held for the university community. There, the preacher would typically set forth a stark contrast between belief and unbelief. We must submit without reserve to the claims of the gospel, the evangelist would urge. No compromises with worldliness are permitted. And this preaching had a powerful influence on Farr's way of viewing reality. It enabled him to see how blessed it would be if we could live for God alone. Compared to the clearness of such a life, our present confused muddle of aims, our self-indulgence, our meanness, and our vanity would seem dark indeed. And so, the theologian here, he's hearing these evangelistic sermons and hearing this evangelist really talk about the importance of belief and the contrast between belief and unbelief. And he listens to these sermons and he's like, yes, wouldn't it be wonderful if everyone believed? And wouldn't it be wonderful if we could take out of the world that the stain that comes from unbelief, the stain that comes from sin? But then on his way home after the service, he'd run into a non-Christian friend who would urge Farr to join him for a drink at a pub. And Farr knew that to accept the person's invitation would signal a weakening of his spiritual resolve. But his friend would persist and reluctantly, or maybe not so reluctantly, I don't know, Farr would agree to join him. And sure enough, Farr would soon find himself thoroughly enjoying these relaxed moments. The friend's humor was admittedly irreverent, but Farr would actually find such humor to be all the better for being a bit wicked. Not that this person was an out-and-out atheist, but he clearly fell into the evangelist's category of the unconverted. The evening wore on. The starkly drawn lines of the evangelist's portrayal began to blur in Farr's mind. They didn't seem to comport well with the pleasure of this friend's company, so much so that Farr was tempted to say to himself, how absurd! Old Robin Johnson, a citizen in the kingdom of darkness. The whole thing's nonsense. Have another drink. Now, Farr knew, of course, that a Christian cannot simply leave it at that, and so he struggles to make theological sense of this kind of experience. How Farr himself deals with the tension theologically is not quite enough to satisfy my Calvinist soul, Mouw says. He decides that he can simply pray for his friend's conversion, even as he celebrates the goodness of the sinner's mere humanity. That may be roughly the right place to end up, but his way of resolving the struggle seems a bit quick to me, Mouw says. Nevertheless, the tension that he describes is indeed a real one. It is one that I think many of us can say we have experienced. The old saw about desiring heaven for the climate and hell for the company might overstate the case, and it may also slip over the edge into blasphemy. But it does point to a set of issues that have to be addressed if some of us are to maintain our theological and spiritual sanity. How do we balance this idea of living pure lives that are in full obedience to God, with the fact that we have unbelieving acquaintances and friends whose company we enjoy and, who frankly add to our lives, add joy in many ways to our lives? How do we deal with that? And that's the question that Mouw deals with here. And it is, I think it's a valid question. Growing up, Brock, I was fortunate enough, partly because of going to Christian schools and being involved in the church, and for a good part of my life living in a community that was, very, very much a Christian community. I didn't, as a young person, I didn't know a lot of non-Christians. And in fact, the people that I was the most concerned about in my life were actually some family members who did not live in our community. And so my first experience with thinking about these issues was about these family members, these people who seem to, and again, we're not talking about atheists. We're talking about people who called themselves Christians, but at that time of life maybe didn't darken the doors of a church very often. And by the way, praise God, these are people now who are church-going people, and there has been changes in their lives, and that's a wonderful thing. But at the time, that's who I was thinking of, and yet these were people that I loved dearly. People that I worried they were going to hell, but I also just loved being around them. And so, how did one deal with that? Today, it's perhaps maybe a little bit more with just acquaintances and people I know, maybe from work. I have an employee who, I really, I enjoy talking to her as a colleague, and think very highly of her skills. And yet I know, she has very specifically said, well, I'm not raising my family with that kind of nonsense. She's very much not a Christian. And how do you deal with that? And how do you understand that this is a person who, I pray for her regularly. I don't know if she would appreciate that. But knowing how much enjoyment I get from working with her. She's a wonderful colleague. She's, an excellent person to even just talk through some personal things with at times, as a colleague. And how do you put that all together? And I assume, Brock, you've dealt with similar things. I think this is probably a common situation for Christians to think about. And that's sort of the seed for Mouw's discussion of common grace. Any thoughts on that, Brock, before we really dive into what Mouw has to say?
My friend, there's such an intensity to this issue that it's this intensity, I think, that drove Professor Mouw toward these lectures on this topic. And it's one that I feel. And beyond saying that my own position is for the doctrine of common grace and the well-meant offer. Beyond that, I wish to say that I feel very much in respect of our brothers and sisters who reject the doctrine. I disagree, of course, with them on this, but I find their thinking as compelling as such thoughts can be, without, of course, converting me to their position. And I hope that comes across as a compliment. I do not mean it in a partisan, pejorative sense. If I did not hold the position that I hold, I think I would hold their position. It impresses me that much. And so to that degree, this truly is a secondary issue in my mind, and should not be one over which brothers and sisters should schism. And so I think the biggest single disappointment for me is that the issue has caused a schism of some intensity. And there's really a lesson here, a retrospective that I wish we could engage in for those of us who really want to be mature. And I don't ask this in a partisan way, meaning that the people who don't agree with me must not be genuine in their motives to be mature. But how did it get so visceral? How did it get so heated and partisan in the negative sense? How did the schism turn cancerous, for lack of a better word? I think that's what Professor Mouw is trying to come to, the point he's trying to reach in lectures like this one and in this book, in this series. Now, you asked me a really great question, and that was, what about the tension that's there? And I want to say that along with Professor Mouw, I really feel it. I wish I could put into words. I don't doubt my position. I think I hold the correct one. But I have to say, this doctrine is so humbling, because it's the kind of doctrine that can unmoor your entire theological edifice, because it's asking some fundamental questions that are worth asking. Now, to answer what happens when the pinball machine of my mind goes tilt, and by the way, with respect to my dear Protestant Reformed Church friends, sometimes earlier in this lecture series, Professor Mouw has said, I confess, I don't really know what the doctrine is or means. And his confession is sometimes taken as an admission of guilt or an admission of an inferior position, because the leading figures on the Protestant Reformed Church side seem to be quite certain about their own position, and to have a certainty that in their mind corresponds with a rigorous knowledge of the issue. It's not in doubt in their thinking. And in their thinking, it's probably to the detriment of Professor Mouw that in some sense he feels like he stands on the shore of this mysterious ocean, unable to plumb its depths. And I regret that our dear PRC brothers think that. And I was thinking about Ecclesiastes chapter 3 in light of this. I think the sentiment Professor Mouw gives comes out of some of the verses here. Starting at verse 9 in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, it says, what do people really get for all their hard work? I have seen the burden God has placed on us all. Yet, God has made everything beautiful for its own time. Now here comes the sentence. He has planted eternity in the human heart. But even so, people cannot see the whole scope of God's work from beginning to end. And then in verse 12, here is the inspired solution from the divine author. So I concluded there is nothing better than to be happy and enjoy ourselves for as long as we can. People should eat and drink and be merry, for these are gifts from God. I really think that highlights where Professor Mouw is coming from here in attempting to resolve the tensions that seems so clearly present. Our dear Protestant Reformed Church brothers think they have a theological framework that resolves these tensions in a nice, clean way Everybody loves the elegance of an elegant, simple, direct solution. How did Alexander the Great conquer the Gordian knot? He cut it with a sword. He didn't try to untangle it. He took a sword and he cut the knot. And so too, I think sometimes our Protestant Reformed Church brothers have done the same approach. They've overlooked the divine knot that is given to us in the scriptures, the mystery of what grace really is, and the mystery of the relationship of God's beneficence, God's goodness, and God's severity, all rolled up into one. And they've taken out their theological swords and they've hacked the knot to pieces. Whereas I think we on our side are trying to untangle that knot. And then, of course, getting frustrated when we're unable to do so. And so this is a secondary matter in my mind. You know, I have no grudge or animus towards people on the other side of this issue from me, and I don't think we should divide over this. While not agreeing with their position, I am impressed enough with their articulation of their position and their reasons, that their justifying reasons, that I'm impressed with their theology. I hope that that's seen as a positive. And Chuck, I know in your situation too, you're very strongly on one side of this issue. And yet, we can see that the history of what happened between these two societies, these two godly Christian societies, did not turn out in the wholesome way that it probably should have. How do you, in your own mind, start to deal with the tension in this?
First of all, I think I deal with that tension by doing something that you did, which is to express appreciation. Right? There is, as you say, there is something to appreciate in the simplicity. And not just simplicity sometimes simplicity seems like a bad word, but here it is an elegance, as you put it, in sort of that position that says the only kind of grace is salvific grace, and you know, also expressing an appreciation that even as I disagree with the position that our Protestant Reformed and other folks, our friends in those churches, take on this issue, also recognizing that their concerns are valid, right? They take the position they do because they have concern about worldliness. They have a concern that if we become so unmoored from issues around salvific grace, that suddenly we can, you know, we can move away from the gospel message. And you know, the reminder that our Protestant Reformed brothers and sisters bring us is that we can never lose that mooring to special grace. We may believe in common grace. We may have these ideas that we'll talk a little bit about why we believe it to be a reality, but we can't let that separate us. We can't let that allow us to take our eyes off the importance of special grace, of salvific grace, because if we do, then we're lost, and so it's a reminder to keep our eyes there, and you know, Mouw, in sort of talking about some of the things that have led him to be convinced that common grace is a valid expression of how God thinks about his creation and about the people that he created. He begins that discussion by, I think, in a way, expressing that same appreciation. He says that here then is the question that I want now to explore. How do we take with utmost seriousness the need to be clear about the lines between unbelief and belief, between those who live within the boundaries of saving grace and those who do not, while at the same time maintaining an openness to and even an active appreciation for all that is good and beautiful and true that takes place outside of those boundaries? Notice what he does there. He doesn't say, okay, well, they believe that, but let's just move on. Let's just talk about common grace because that's what we agree with. No, he expresses that appreciation by saying, look, we have to be clear about the lines between belief and unbelief. We have to be clear about the line between those who do not live within the boundaries of saving grace and those who do not. There are those who have been saved, and there are those who have not been. And we can't forget that. Even as we talk about this openness and appreciation for that which is good and beautiful and true that takes place outside of those boundaries, that boundary cannot be forgotten. That line that runs even sometimes within our own hearts between good and evil, the antithesis, is something that we must always keep our minds on. And I think, Brock, in recent decades, there has been some discussion that some folks in the neo-Calvinist tradition, the neo-Calvinist tradition of Kuyper and Bavinck, and that really has a great appreciation for common grace. There has been some discussion that at times some in that camp, that's my camp. So some in my camp have occasionally forgotten about those bright lines, and that's dangerous. And so it is a good reminder in that regard. Now, one of the things that Bavinck does here that I really appreciate is he has this section on what he calls extra salvific assessments, and it's just really sort of a way of saying, well, how can we look at this concept of God loving His creation outside of just the prisms of salvation? Those prisms of salvation are very meaningful, and we're not going to lose those. But there are ways of looking at all of creation sort of in a bigger picture. And so Mouw says, as we think about God, the appreciation for all that is good and beautiful and true, we can't attempt to answer this question without attending to the closely related topic of God's disposition in this regard. And so, again, what I appreciate something that Mouw does here, which is rather than starting with our human reactions, right? And it's easy to do that, right? We have these experiences, these human experiences of having friends, that we appreciate who appear not to be saved, and enjoying their company. We have the experience of seeing things being created and done in the world that seem to be good things, but being done by unsaved, non-Christian people. And what Mouw says, okay, that's fine, but let's start with, well, what is God's disposition towards these people, and let's let that color our own disposition rather than making our own thoughts primary here. And so that's what Mouw does. And he says, look, this is the way that Calvinists enter into this discussion. Our likes and dislikes must be brought into conformity with God's approvals and disapprovals. And when we restrict our focus to salvific matters, the basic patterns of God's likes and dislikes are very clear. God is surely favorably disposed to the elect, having graciously chosen to point them in the direction of a glorious heavenly destiny. And he's not favorably disposed toward the non-elect, since he has, in the words of the Canons of Dort, decreed to leave them in the common misery into which they have willfully plunged themselves. The crucial question, though, is whether salvific categories are adequate to cover all of God's dispositions towards human beings, both redeemed and unredeemed. Is the ultimate destiny of human beings the only thing that God thinks about in assessing what we think, feel, and do? It is definitely one of those things. It may even be the most important thing, but is it the only thing that God thinks about in assessing how we think, feel, and do? And so then Mouw talks a little bit about a similar story to that of Austin Farr that he tells at the beginning of this chapter, and one that has, as he puts it, more direct relevance for Calvinists, and it has to do with George Whitefield. Mouw points out that there's this biography of George Whitefield by Harry Stout, and he reports that Whitefield, during his extensive time in North America, formed a deep friendship with Benjamin Franklin. Now, Benjamin Franklin wasn't exactly a Calvinist believer, was he? He, by all appearances, may not have been among the elect. And so Mouw says anyone who knows anything about the convictions of these two men has to be a bit surprised by the fact of this friendship. Whitefield exhibited all of the characteristics usually associated with the term Puritan: a strong affirmation of Calvinist doctrine, a devotion to moral rectitude, and a stern demeanor. And that's not really Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin was well known as a religious skeptic, given to irreverent comments, who had the reputation for being a womanizer. We don't know for sure, but it does seem like, he may have been among the non-elect. And by the way, we don't know that, and so we don't want to put people to eternal judgment without knowing it. But there is also this sense that by their fruits you shall know them, and there certainly were different fruits for Benjamin Franklin as for George Whitefield. So Mouw asks the question then, well, okay, did God approve of the fact that Whitefield enjoyed spending time with Benjamin Franklin? In one sense, of course, any Calvinist might allow an affirmative answer to that question. There may have been some important God-ordained goal for which the friendship between the two was an important predestined means. Of course there was, right? There was a reason God put these two people together, and it was for his glory. So, okay, that's part of it. But let's talk about the friendship itself, Mouw says. Did God approve of the ways in which Whitefield enjoyed his relationship with Franklin? Did he see the friendly give and take between the two of them as a pleasant thing to behold? Was God gratified by the ways in which their written correspondence was crafted? Was Whitefield's commitment to Franklin, his caring about his friend's physical well-being, his desire to stay in Franklin's home when he visited Philadelphia, his pain over some of Franklin's specific misdeeds, was that something that God wanted to happen simply because God himself cares about what goes on in a friendship, even when one of the friends is not numbered among the elect? How do we take with utmost seriousness the need to be clear about the lines between belief and unbelief, between those who live within the boundaries of saving grace and those who do not, while at the same time maintaining an openness and active appreciation for all that is good, beautiful, and true that takes place outside of those boundaries? He repeats those words that he said earlier. And what he does is he ties it then to things that we know about God, right? Things that we know about his character and about the way that God reveals himself to us. And he starts by talking about, well, if God is glorified by his non-human creation, and that seems like a fairly modest claim to endorse, well, then it seems reasonable to assume that God takes delight in those non-human created phenomena. So in other words, we've got in Scripture, and we have it right there in the beginning of Genesis, we see God taking delight in non-human parts of creation, and in the soaring of an eagle, in the rippling of a brook, and I think we can understand that God certainly takes delight in those things, and yet those are things that are outside merely the categories of salvation and non-salvation, right? A brook isn't subject to salvation. It's subjected to sin in a way, but a brook hasn't sinned against God. It's only maybe, because of the pollution or whatever, it's maybe feeling the effects of sin. Similarly, an eagle doesn't sin against God. Maybe, again, it's affected by that, but it doesn't sin against God. And so the salvific issues are not a part of that particular kind of appreciation. Well, if that's the case, then cannot we say that God's appreciation, his joy that he takes in his creation, the glory his glory that's reflected in these things, could that not said to then reflect categories beyond just simply salvation? And Mouw's suggestion is yes. It doesn't mean that those categories go away, but it means that there are these other issues. And then he also talks about God's moral approval and how, in many ways, around issues like aesthetics and even moral appraisals, God sees good in things that he has created, even when that good is coming out of the non-elect. And that's a difficult. It's often difficult to think of, but what this brings to mind for me, and I think I've told this story before. I remember being a young teenager. I must have been, I don't know, it might have been 12 or 13 when the movie Gandhi came out. And at the time, we were living in Sioux Center, Iowa, and Sioux Center, Iowa did not have a movie theater. Thanks, Reverend B.J. Hahn. And that's a story we'll tell some other time. And so we had to drive quite a ways to go see movies. And so we drove to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which is about a 60, 65, 70-mile drive from Sioux Center. I was reminded about just how long that drive was this Thanksgiving when I went and picked up my mom in Sioux Center and then drove up to Sioux Falls to see my brother and his wife and most of his kids, which, by the way, was wonderful. But it's a lengthy trip. So we went to go see the movie. We saw Gandhi, and it's a long movie too. I don't know if you've ever seen it, Brock, but it's a long movie. And so after the movie, we probably stopped and, back in the day, stopped at Pizza Hut and got some pizza. And then we took the long drive home. And I remember it being dark. We're not talking about 4-lane roads here. We're talking about 2-lane roads. The one road that we used to take out of South Dakota was a little bit of a winding road. And so it was a long, long drive. And my father, I remember him just sort of speculating and wondering and thinking. And I think he did this not so much out of a real belief that Gandhi could have been saved despite not being a Christian, but more to spark in us, myself and my brothers, some thinking on these issues. And he asked us, well, Gandhi did some really good things, some really important things. He had a major impact in several countries. He really, even though he was not successful in overturning the apartheid system in South Africa, it was really sort of the beginning of those challenges. And he persuaded a lot of folks to fight against that. And then in India, certainly, his nonviolent ideas led to an independent India without the violent revolution that occurred in many other places. And as a result, even today, I think even though India is still a poor country and still suffers from various types of poverty, it hasn't experienced some of the really super negative things that have happened in countries where that independence came only after lengthy revolution and the death of thousands and thousands of people in wars and revolutions. And so my father asked, well, what do you think? Might Gandhi be in heaven? I mean, he did all these good things. And I remember saying, but he can't be. He can't be in heaven unless he became a Christian. Now, maybe he became a Christian at the last second, but there's no evidence of that. We can hope for it, I guess. But without that evidence, can we really believe that that's the case? And yet, much good came from what Gandhi did, and much good that I think God probably appreciated, and we see that that moral approval is likely from God in these situations. And then finally, he talks about divine empathy, and he says, Mouw says, this is a little bit different than sort of salvific favor. Well, a lot different from salvific favor. It's about having a divine favor that is not necessarily a saving favor towards the elect and non-elect alike. But here, what about empathy beyond just simply favor? Is it plausible for us to think that there are times when God looks favorably upon the non-elect in this sense, that he has empathy for their very real experiences of joy and sadness, just as he certainly does for those of the elect? And Mouw spends some time sort of diving into not only some of the theology around that, but some of the history of some of the thinking around that, and comes to the conclusion that, of course, God is a God of empathy. And empathy, you can have empathy even when you disagree, even when you oppose, you can have empathy. And we've talked about that a little bit, even within our own, and we're not talking about putting, people who don't believe in common grace into some other category of non-Christian at all. But, we've talked about that empathy for a position that we find that we disagree with, and yet we find something valuable there. Mouw takes this much further and says, yes, God has empathy and sees value in things that he's created, even among the non-elect. That doesn't mean divine favor, especially as it comes to salvific favor. He isn't going to take that empathy and turn it into, well, okay, you were a rebellious sinner who fought against everything I ever did, but I don't care about that. That's not what God does. And yet there is still this empathy from God, and that really then is a way of thinking about grace outside of these salvific categories. Now, I just spent a long time kind of talking about these things, Brock, but and sort of repeating a little bit of what Mouw is saying. But what do you think about these arguments that Mouw makes here? Are some of them a little stronger than others? I sometimes wonder, when you make an argument, a set of arguments, and you put some in certain order, sometimes it's because some of them are a little stronger than others. But I'm wondering, what do you think of this case that Mouw lays for the way God thinks about unbelievers, and outside of these salvific categories, about things like divine empathy and moral approval?
Yeah, great question, my friend. And so let me answer short and sweet and to the point, and then I'll unpack. So the short answer is, yes, I'm convinced. I think Mouw makes great points. I'm also impressed by how unconvincing these great points are to our dear friends who reject the doctrine. I think one of the stories that is so striking to me along this path, when I read it as a young boy, it's in Genesis chapter 20. And this is the story of Abraham and Sarah and Abimelech, the wife stealer. And so we're introduced. Abraham moves south to the Negev, moved on to Gerar. He's living as a foreigner in these places where he sojourns. And it was customary for Abraham to introduce his wife by saying, "She is my sister." And I think we have to ask the reason why. Now, the text does not explicitly say this, but there are strong hints that it is more than just, there's a strong reason, not just a token reason, why Abraham does this. And there's no reason here that's to his credit, but it's very understandable. His wife is beautiful, and he is in a lawless, worthless, nasty place where people just take what they want. And if you don't give it to them, they kill you first and ask questions later. That's the strong sense I get from reading this interaction. Now, I'm going to tell you, Chuck, it says, "Thou shalt not lie." But when I walk in certain parts of my city and someone comes up to me with a knife or a gun and says, "Hand me your wallet," first of all, I hand it. I hand it over. And then they say to me, "Do you have any more money on you?" I don't tell them the truth. It's for them to listen. I'm not going to assist in my own robbery. And so I don't particularly say, "Well, you know, I wasn't going to say anything, but now you've asked the question, and as a Christian, I'm obligated to tell you the truth, for it would be against the commandment to tell you a lie." No, I'm like, and also I'm not going to say to the guy with the knife, "Well, figure it out, bozo." That's a bad move. And so I think that's something similar to what Abraham is facing here, except instead of people coming up to him with a knife and asking for his wallet, they're asking for his wife. And so he's behaving the way he's behaving, not particularly virtuous, but in a situation like this, I think we can all understand why our behavior is far less than civilized and ideal in non-civilized and non-ideal situations. So, the local potentate, King Abimelech, sends for Sarah. "Hey, beautiful woman, let me add her to my beautiful woman collection." And we have this strong ideal that men are supposed to defend and protect their wives. We talk about this creation order, and I affirm that. But here Abraham is not doing that. And it is up, if the situation is going to be salvaged, it is up to God himself to act. And in verse 3, he does just that. So verse 3 says, "But that night God came to Abimelech in a dream and told him, 'You are a dead man. For that woman you have taken is already married.'" And by the way, let's take a note here. God knows how to break some eggs. God knows how to make an omelet. And he doesn't come to this young thug, let me say it, this young thug who takes what he wants at the threat of death to those who resist him. He doesn't mince words. He comes in the dream and says, "You are a dead man." And you know what? Thugs don't get niceties and little wine and tea parties where we lift up the teacups and have a nice little discussion. "Oh, Lord, how are you today?" "Well, I'm doing fine, my friend. Let's talk about some niceties before we..." "Oh, that's great. I love our diplomatic conversation." No, he comes in to the thug and he deals with the thug at the thug's level where he's going to get it. "You are a dead man." Even thugs Know what that means. But an interesting thing happens here. Verse 4 says this, Abimelech had not slept with her yet. So he said, Lord, by the way, what's up with this young man-stealing thug speaking properly to the Lord? Lord, he says, will you destroy an innocent nation? Didn't Abraham tell me she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother. I acted in complete innocence. My hands are clean. Now, first of all, let's take a step back here. Only in Abimelech's mind did he act in complete innocence, because he's got a regular habit of helping himself to the best-looking women that come through his region. Now, the Lord doesn't banter and, have the wine and cheese discussion with him about it. He just gets right to the point, and he says something really interesting. In the dream, God responded, yes, I know you are innocent. That's why I kept you from sinning against me, and why I did not let you touch her. Wow. Wow. Now here it comes. Return the woman to her husband, and he will pray for you, for he is a prophet, and you will live. But if you don't return her to him, you can be sure that you and all of your people will die. Abimelech gets up next morning, quickly calls his servants together. He told them what happened. His men were terrified. Abimelech calls for Abraham. What have you done to us? He demanded. What crime have I committed that deserves treatment? What? He's this woman stealer, this human trafficker might be words we would use today, is playing the victim. What crime have I done, making me and my kingdom guilty of this great sin? I mean, I thought it was a legitimate steal. You can hear it out of him. This is how morally degraded they are. And then he says this, no one should ever do what you have done. What? Abimelech. And finally he said, whatever possessed you to do such a thing? And listen to Abraham in verse 11. Abraham replied, I thought, this is a godless place. They will want my wife and will kill me to get her. And Abraham was not wrong. Now, what do we see in this story? We see a filthy, vile, human trafficking thug restrained by God. A gracious act, it is described as. And I think that that's such a pattern for how our behaviors in the world are. Chuck, you and I and everybody we come in contact, there's a tendency for us to think very highly of ourselves in this post-enlightenment, post-medieval modern ethos of freedom and autonomy and self-government, and man is basically good sorts of anthropology. There's a lot of that going around where we do abominable things, and yet God restrains us from the worst. And he lavishes a grace upon us. Not only does he give us good things, which, by the way, this is an important thing to note. The PRC folks do not deny. They explicitly say this. We do not deny that God does good things and gives good gifts to the undeserving. We simply say that we cannot call those gracious. And so we see actually in this little mini situation a microcosm of the human condition itself. Now, our PRC friends make an interesting, sharp distinction. It cannot be said that anything short of salvific is properly called grace. That's the thesis. Now, they hold such a strong frame that, like I say, it's almost convincing. And yet, I want to share that there are some reasons why I think the Bible gives us warrant to hold to this position from Professor Mouw. Let's start with Psalm 145. Verse 8, the Lord is merciful and compassionate, slow to get angry, and filled with unfailing love. Now, under the PRC scenario, this is probably a statement in their minds about the elect. And yet the next verse says this, the Lord, verse 9, is good to everyone. He showers compassion on all his creation. All of your works will thank you, Lord. And your faithful followers will praise you. Verse 13, the Lord always keeps his promises. He is gracious in all he does. 14, the Lord helps the fallen. He lifts those bent beneath their loads. 15, the eyes of all look to you in hope. You give them their food as they need it. You open your hand and satisfy the hunger and thirst of every living thing. Dear Protestant Reformed friends, doesn't say God satisfies the hunger and thirst of the elect here. Every living thing, verse 17, the Lord is righteous in everything he does. He's filled with kindness. Now, these very same verses which talk of this graciousness that is applied not simply to the elect. I mean, it's hard to be much clearer than that. The very same psalm will say in verse 20, the Lord protects all those who love him, but he destroys the wicked. Now we're back to the tension. But I want to ask my Protestant Reformed friends, can you not see why we might hold that there's a way to speak about grace that is not salvific? A way that the scripture gives us. One more passage. Isaiah chapter 55. Is anyone thirsty? It asks. Come and drink, even if you have no money. Come, take your choice of wine or milk. It's all free. Verse 3, come to me with your ears wide open. Listen, and you will find life. I will make an everlasting covenant with you. I will give you all the unfailing love I promised to David. Verse 6, seek the Lord while you can find him. Call on him now while he is near. Let the wicked change their ways and banish the very thought of doing wrong. Let the elect change their ways. No, let the wicked change their ways. There's no qualification here that limits the scope of what's being said in this passage simply to the elect. Let them, the wicked, turn to the Lord that he may have mercy on them. Yes, turn to our God. Why? For he will forgive generously. Who will he forgive generously? The elect my Protestant Reformed folks will say. And I know because I've talked to them about it, and they have made this statement. That's who this is to the elect. Okay, but the passage does not make such a qualification. And so, without asking my PRC folks to agree with me on the position, my first question is, can you at least see why Dr. Mouw has the position that he has? Can you at least acknowledge the tension that's there? And I think doing so brings us closer together as brothers and sisters in Christ. Chuck, let me throw it over to you for some final thoughts there and a close in prayer.
Yeah, and sort of in closing up and finishing up, I just kind of want to refer again to some of the things that Mouw says here that I think are really helpful and resonate with me. In sort of as he begins to conclude his lecture here, Mouw tells another story, and it comes from the novel called The Diary of a Country Priest by Georges Bernanos. And I've quoted Bernanos on a number of things, and I haven't read this book. I'm going to have to read this novel sometime. But in this novel, the priest whose life and ministry is chronicled throughout the book is he lays dying, and the fellow priest who's been called to administer last rites hasn't yet arrived. And so the friend of this priest who's dying expresses regret about that the priest who can give last rites is probably not going to make it. He's not going to get there. But as the priest dies, he utters these words: "Does it matter? Grace is everywhere. Grace is everywhere." Now, again, if grace is just salvific grace, well, then maybe it isn't everywhere, because that would lead us to a form of universalism. But what does it mean that grace is everywhere? And what Mouw does is he points to a number of Reformed thinkers, Abraham Kuyper, John Calvin as well, who had a deep understanding of the fact that without God's restraining hand, our world would be in such chaos that we would all be lost. For Calvin, the world is engulfed at every moment by a flood of iniquity, which must be continually restrained by God, lest it rush forth and engulf the earth. And the iniquitous threat here is not primarily a human one. Without God's constant bridling activity, all of creation would slip into disarray. And not only must God keep the chaotic waters within their appointed bounds, he must also continually bridle the animals lest they come forth and devour people. He must bridle people lest they devour each other. For Calvin, the bridle of divine providence curbs the wicked and the devil, lest they completely overturn all order and make life unlivable. Without God's grace towards his creation, his restraining grace, we would be destroyed, and not just simply by sin, but by the effect sin has had on all sorts of things on the creation. And it reminds me of Psalm 46. Psalm 46 is one of my favorite psalms. I think I've probably quoted it here multiple times already. But Psalm 46 says this: "God is our refuge and strength, and ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their surging." God is our refuge and our strength. He's protecting us from all that chaos that is around us. And this is a graceful act of God. Grace is all around us, because it has to be, because God is constantly restraining the chaos, restraining the earth from giving way and the mountains from falling into the heart of the sea, the waters roaring and foaming and the mountains quaking with their surging. And then God provides for us as well. He gracefully provides. The psalm continues, "There's a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells. God is within her, she will not fall. God will help her at break of day. Nations are in uproar, kingdoms fall, he lifts his voice, the earth melts. The Lord Almighty is with us, the God of Jacob is our fortress. That reference to that river whose streams make glad the city of God is interesting because the city of God is often thought of as Jerusalem, right? And Jerusalem didn't have a river, and yet this psalm, most people believe that this psalm was one of the later written psalms and may have been written even after the exile. But if that's the case, they certainly the person who wrote this and the people who sang this psalm would have known the story of Hezekiah. So you had in King Hezekiah became aware that the Assyrians were going to be sieging Jerusalem. And this was at the time of the fall of Israel, before the fall of Judah. And the siege is going to happen. And so what did Hezekiah do? Because he's warned by God about this, what he is able to do is he's able to divert an underground stream so that the water that is underground is diverted to the city, so that when this siege comes, the people in the city still have fresh water and they can survive. And God was the one who warned Hezekiah of this. God is the one who provides this fresh water. And so I think the people who sang this psalm would know that story and think of that little stream. And yet there's something more here, because that little stream isn't really a river. It was just a little stream that God provided, but it does show God's grace to provide his people. But we can also look forward, and we think also of the city of God as being the new heavens and the new earth. And that image of the river whose streams make glad the city of God reminds us of the Garden of Eden, and the river that flows through the Garden of Eden and then goes to all the four corners of the earth and bringing that water everywhere. Well, in the new heavens and the new earth, that's the same thing. This river has its source now in God, at the throne of God, just as it had its source in the Garden of Eden. And then it flows to the ends of the earth, this grace that God is providing everywhere. We see that in the images here in Psalm 46 as well. And then come and see what the Lord has done. The desolations he's brought on the earth. He makes war cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire. And he says, "Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress." God is saying to his people, be quiet, be still. This is not just, take some quiet time to yourself and then you'll know that everything is okay. No, this is God rebuking his people when they don't understand all of this grace that he's providing to them and saying, hey, be still and know that I am God. I am the one who protects you. I am the one who provides for you. You need to, pay attention to that. You need to sort of let go of this idea that you can do things on your own, and remember that I'm the God who prevails, and that there is grace in that prevailing as well. And so I just love the title of that section that says grace is everywhere, because it is everywhere. It's in God's holding back the chaos. It's in his providing the things that we need, and it is in his prevailing against all of the evil in the world. There is a salvific part to that, right? We still have to remember that there is salvific grace, and it is only the believers who will experience that part of grace, and yet grace is still everywhere. And I just find that comforting and amazing. And something to rest in, not to rest in as we sometimes think of be still as, just go off in the wilderness and think about God a little bit and everything be okay. But actually God rebuking us and saying, you need to trust in my grace. You need to understand that my grace is sufficient, that I am doing this. I am holding back evil because of my love for my creation, even those who have rebelled against me, even those who I have not saved out of their rebellion. I'm still, even for them, providing a level of grace. It's not salvific grace, but it is a level of grace. And I think that's amazing and worth holding on to. Yeah, let's close in prayer. Our Father, you are our refuge and our strength and ever-present help in time of trouble. You are a God who protects us. You are a God who provides for us, and you are a God who will prevail. You are a God of grace. And as we talk about these issues, help us also to be people of grace as we discuss these issues. Help us to see your grace in all things. And that grace, while it may not be salvific grace for all things, we don't necessarily hold to some sort of universality, but we know that you have the power of that grace, and that you alone determine how you will use that grace, and you have determined that grace will be used, that you use that to protect us and to provide for us and to prevail against the evil of this world. And in that, we can take comfort. We praise you, O God, for who you are. We praise you, O God, for your grace, which is everywhere. In your name we pray. Amen.